Dear aspirant, today I am here to talk about 2014 UPSC CSC CSAT paper 2. So we discuss 10 to 12 passages. First passage is, in recent times, India has grown fast not only compared to its own past but also in comparisons with other nations, but there cannot be say room for complacency because it is possible for the Indian economy to develop even faster and also to spread the benefits of this growth more widely than has been done thus far. Before going into details of the kinds of microstructural changes that we need to conceptualize and then proceeds to implement, it is worthwhile elaborating on the idea of inclusive growth that constitutes the defining concepts behind this government's various economic policies and decisions. A nations interested in inclusive growth views the same growth differently depending on whether the gains of the growth are heaped primarily on a small segments or shared widely by the populations. The latter is cause for celebrations, but not the former. In other words, growth must not be treated as an end in itself, but as an instrument for spreading prosperity to all. India's own past experience and the experience of other nations suggest that growth is necessary for eradicating poverty, but it is not a sufficient conditions. In other words, policies for promoting growth need to be complemented with policies to ensure that more and more people join in the growth process, and further that there are mechanisms in place to redistribute some of the gains to those who are unable to partake in the market process and hence get left behind. A simple way of giving this idea of inclusive growth a sharper form is to a nation's because a nation's progress in terms of the progress of its poorest segments, for instance, the bottom 20% of the populations. One could measure the per capita income of the bottom quintile of the populations and also calculate the growth rate of income and evaluate our economic success in terms of these measures that pertains to the poorest segment. This approach is attractive because it does not ignore growth like some of the older heterodox criteria did. It simply look at the growth of income of the poorest sections of the populations. It also ensured that those who are outside of the bottom quintiles do not get ignored. If that were done, then those peoples would in all likelihoods drop down into the bottom quintile and so would automatically become a direct target of our policies. Hence, the criteria being suggested here is a statistical summing up of the idea of inclusive growth, which in turn lead to two corollaries to which that India must strives to achieve a high growth and that we must work to ensure that the weakest segments benefit from the growth. So, first questions. The author centers focus as on applauding India's economic growth not only against its own past performance but against other nations, emphasizing the need for economic growth, which is the sole determinant of a country's prosperity. Emphasizing inclusive growth where gains of growth are shared widely by the populations, emphasizing high growth. So answer is says C. Emphasizing inclusive growth where gains of growth are shared widely by the populations. Question number 2. The author supports policies which will help develop economic growth, better distributions of income irrespective of rate of growth, develop economic growth and redistributes economic gains to those getting left behind. Put an emphasis on the developments of the poorest segments of society. So answer is C. Developed economic growth and redistributes economic gains to those getting left behind. Question number 3. Consider the following statements. According to the author, India's economy has grown, but there is no room for complacency as growth eradicates poverty. Growth has resulted in prosperity for all. Which of the statement given are correct? So answer is D. Neither one nor two. Passage 2. It is easy for the government to control state-owned companies through nodes and wings. So what really need to be done as a first step is to put petrol pricings on a transparent formula. If the price of crudes is X, then the exchange rate Y. Then every month or fortnight, the government announces a maximum price of petrols, which anybody can work out from the X and the Y. The rule has to be worked out to make sure that the oil marketing companies can in general cover their cost. This will mean that if one company can innovates and cut cost, it will make greater profits. Hence, firms will be more prone to innovates and be efficient. So under these systems, once the rule is announced, there should be no interference by the governments. If this is done for a while, private companies will re-enter these markets, and once a sufficient number of them are in the fray, we can remove the rule-based pricings and leave it truly to the market, subject to, of course, the usual regulations of antitrust and other competitions level. So consider the following statements. According to the passage, an oil company can make greater profits if a transparent formula for petrol pricing is announced every fortnight or monthly by promoting its sales, undertaking innovations, cutting cost, selling its equally shares at higher prices. Which of the statement are correct? So answer is B, 2 and 3. Undertaking innovations, cutting cost. Question number 5. Consider the following statements. According to the passage, private oil companies re-enter the oil producing markets if a transparent rule-based petrol pricing exists. There is no government interference in the oil producing markets. Subsidies are given by the governments. Regulations of antitrust are removed. So which of the statement are correct? So answer is A, 1 and 2. A transparent rule-based petrol pricing exists. There is no government interference in the oil producing markets. So we find next passage. There is next passage. Climate change poses potential devastating effects on India's agriculture. While the overall percentages of climate change are increasingly accepted, a 1 degree centigrade average temperature increase over the next 30 years, sea levels rise of less than 10 centimeter in the same periods, and regional monsoons variations and corresponding droughts, the impacts in India are likely to be quite sides and crop specific. Some crops may respond favorably to the changing conditions, others may not. The emphasizes the need to promote agriculture research and create maximum flexibility in the systems to permit adaptations. The key ingredients for drought proofing is the managed exchange, managed research and aquifers to ensure continued yields of important staple crops, that is wheats. It may also be necessary to shift the locations where their crops are grown in response to temperatures changes as well as to water availability. The latter will be a key factor in making long-term investment decisions. For example, water runoff from the Himalayas is predicted to increase over the next 30 years as glaciers melt, but then decline substantially thereafter. It will be critical to provide incentives to plan for these large-scale shifts in agroecological conditions. India needs to make long-term investments in research and developments in agriculture. India is likely to experience changed weather patterns in future conditions. The following statements: climate change may force the shiftings of locations of the existing crops due to melting of glacier, water availability and temperature availability at other locations, poor productivity of crops, wider adaptability of crop plants. Which of the statement given are correct? So answer is very easy. Answer is B, 2 and 3. Water availability and temperatures suitability at other locations, poor productivity of crops. Question number 14. According to the passage, why is it important to promote agricultural research in India? To predict variations in monsoon patterns and to manage water resources, to make long-term investments decisions for economic growth, to facilitate wider adaptability of crops, to predict drought conditions and to research aquifers. So answer is C, to facilitate wider adaptability of crops. Passage 2. It is essential that we mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases and thus avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change that would take place in coming years, and decides mitigations would require a major shifts in the way we produces and consume energy. A shift away from overwhelming dependence on fossil fuels is now long overdue, but unfortunately, technological development has been slow and inadequate, largely because government policies have not protected investments in research and developments myopically. As a result of relatively low prices of oils. It is now therefore imperative for a country like India treating the opportunity of harnessing renewables energy on a large scale as a national imperative. This country is extremely well endowed with solar, wind and biomass sources of energy. Where we have lagged unfortunately is in our ability to develop and to create technological solutions for harnessing these resources. One particular trajectory for carrying out straightened mitigations of greenhouse gas emissions assessed by the intergovernmental panels on climate change clearly shows the need for ensuring that global emissions of greenhouse gases peak no later than 2015 and reduce rapidly. Therefore, the cost associated with such a trajectory is truly modest and would amounts in the estimates of IPCC to not more than 3% of the global GDP in 2030. In other words, the level of prosperity that the world would have reached without mitigations would at worst be postponed by a few months or a year at the most. This is clearly not a very high price to pay for protecting hundreds of millions of peoples from the worst risks associated with climate change. Any each efforts, however, would require lifestyles to change appropriately. Also, mitigations of greenhouse gas emissions is not a more technological fix and clearly requires changes in lifestyles and transformations of a country's economic structures, whereby effective reductions in emissions is brought about, such as through the consumptions of much lower quantities of animal proteins. The Food and Agriculture Organizations (FAO) has determined that the emissions from the livestock sectors amount to 18% of the total. The reductions of emissions from this source is entirely in the hands of human beings who have never questioned the impacts that their dietary habits of consuming more and more animal proteins are bringing about. Mitigations overall has huge co-benefits such as lower air pollution and health benefits, higher energy security, and greater employments. So, first question is, according to the passage, which of the following would help in the mitigations of greenhouse gases, including the consumptions of meats, rapid economic liberalizations, reducing the consumerisms, modern management practices of livestock? Select the correct answer using the codes given below. So answer is C, 1 and 3. Reducing the consumptions of meat, reducing the consumerism. Question number 16. Why do we continue to depend on the fossil fuels heavily? Inadequate technological developments, inadequate funds for research and developments, inadequate availability of alternative sources of energy. Select the correct answer using the codes given below. So answer is D, 1, 2 and 3. Inadequate technological developments, inadequate funds for research and developments, inadequate availability of alternative sources of energy. Question number 17. According to the passage, how does the mitigations of greenhouse gases help us? Reduces expenditures on public health, reduce dependence on livestock, reduce reduce energy requirements, reduce rates of global climate change. Select the correct answer using the codes given below. So answer is B, 1, 3 and 4. That means reduces expenditures on public health, reduces energy requirements, reduces rates of global climate change. What is the essential message of the passage? We continue to depend on fossil fuels heavily. Mitigations of the greenhouse gases is imperatives. We must invest in research and developments. People must change their lifestyles. So answer is B. Mitigations of the greenhouse gases is imperative. So today lecture we finish here. If you like my channel, please subscribe and share it. Thank you.